Now we make a big shift in our study of the book of Genesis. We spent the first 3 lectures thinking about primeval history and how to study that history. We come to a distinct break in the book of Genesis when we get to the story of Abraham. And so at the very end of the 11th chapter and then into the 12th chapter, we hit really material of a very different kind, a sustained story about an individual. We will have a second story within this section that's very similar in terms of Jacob. And then at chapter 37, we move to another section of the book of Genesis, and we hear the Joseph novella. So really a different type of literature, but when we call it a novella, as opposed to the Abraham and Jacob cycles, stories about them. Of course, when we think of our patriarchs and matriarchs, we think of Abraham and Sarah, we think of Isaac and Rebekah, and we think of Jacob and perhaps his favorite wife, Rachel. And those are very significant, but at the same time, the story really does focus on Abraham at the beginning, and then the second story focuses on Jacob. Isaac usually seems to always come across as either Abraham's son, Rebekah's husband, or Jacob's father. We don't have a lot of distinct material on Isaac. Therefore, this lecture will be on Abraham and the following lecture on Jacob, and we will certainly discuss Isaac and his wife Rebekah at times. Now, when we think of Abraham, we have a number of new ideas that are coming to us. We move from these stories of being made in the image and likeness of God and humans rebelling against that and trying to set up their own identity, to now one of our great heroes of the Old Testament, Abraham, and really a hero of the New Testament and a hero of all 3 of the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So what makes Abraham a hero? Well, we see Abraham as someone who corresponds with God and dialogues with God, and for the most part, as an exemplary character. Abraham has a couple of shortcomings, but by and large, he is always a model of someone for us that hears a call and responds to that call in a heroic fashion. Some complications arise around Abraham as we try to kind of think about him, because, as I said, he really appears to be the first and greatest of the patriarchs. And yet, why isn't Israel named for him? That has to kind of leave us thinking a little bit. Israel ends up being named for Jacob, whose name changes to Israel. So we have to kind of consider that a little bit and realize that there seems to be something different underlying this story of Abraham. Different messages for us, and perhaps a story emanating from a different time period, and certainly capturing a different time period. Before, we've spoken about when a couple of the stories were written, and we said that perhaps the first chapter of Genesis was written during the Babylonian exile, maybe around 550. Well, there would seem to be a number of elements to the Abraham story that would also suggest that it too was written at a later period, and a period where the focus may have been going off of the kingdom of Israel and the 12 tribes, going from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, to just really the province of Judah and Jerusalem, its capital, with Simeon being another minor part of that. Because Abraham ultimately becomes well known throughout the south of Judah. So he's equated with the city of Hebron in south of Jerusalem, and he's equated with the city of Beersheba, also south of Jerusalem. So we find that the Abraham story might not be, in some respects, as universal for all 12 tribes of Israel. And so this is a challenge to us and makes us think about this story a little bit differently. But this in no way diminishes Abraham. So let us think about some other key aspects to his story. Abraham means the father of a multitude. And that's the great promise to him and the reality that he struggles with. But it's a faithful struggle that has much to teach us. Abraham is a man with 2 clear wives and perhaps another substitute wife. So we see Sarah as his first wife, and then we move on to Hagar as a substitute wife, and then he ends his life with Keturah after the death of Sarah, and he has more children with her. So he appears to have about 8 children through these 3 wives. When we reflect on the importance of Abraham, we see that, as I've mentioned, in the literature that follows the book of Genesis. So for Paul, Abraham is our father in faith and shows us a way for both Jews and Gentiles to follow God more closely. We see in the book of Isaiah that Abraham is referred to as God's friend. That gives us some sense of just how important this figure is. And so as we think about Abraham's importance, we need to start thinking a little bit more about his stories, and primarily, or let's say firstly, about the call that Abraham answers. So let us now read that call from the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis. So in verse 2 we hear God saying to Abram, because Abraham doesn't receive that full name until the 17th chapter. So like Jacob, his name is changed as his relationship with God changes. So God says to Abram in chapter 12, "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you." So we start off with this call to Abram to follow God and to leave his homeland, his father, and his religion and culture behind him, and journey to a new land and to be with a new people and a new culture. This is something that we can't take for granted. And at the same time, it's something that many of us, or perhaps our parents and grandparents, have an experience of. Abraham is an immigrant. Abraham, in many respects, starts off in exile. Now, he makes that exile his home, but that is a story that connects Abraham to so many of us, especially here in the United States, a land of immigrants. So Abraham's story, if it isn't our story, is certainly the story of many of our parents or grandparents. We see then Abraham take off on that journey with God, and it's a journey of challenges and surprises. And so, once again, this instructs us, this story, to read the Bible carefully, to read the Bible with an openness, to not close down the Bible with our expectations, but instead understand the expectations of God. Because we know that Abram is our hero in these opening stories. But what we surprisingly find is that there are many different heroes, and that the foreigners, people often who are cast aside as enemies, people who don't fit in, people who, the Israelites and many other cultures want to blame for their problems, have very strong roles in this story. And three of them that we'll think about as we're moving through are Melchizedek, Hagar, and Abimelech, with maybe also a thought to Pharaoh during this time period. So we start this story, and Abram makes that journey. He, in some ways, concludes the journey that his father took. His father went from Ur of the Chaldeans in the south, probably near the city of Uruk, a great city of the Sumerian kingdom in the 3rd millennium, up to Haran in the north of Mesopotamia. And then Abram completes that journey, moving through various parts of Israel. We hear him at Shechem and Bethel, I believe, but then becomes situated in Beersheba in Hebron. Now, Abram encounters a famine while he's there, a very difficult time. We know that the land of Israel suffers from famines. Unlike Mesopotamia, and most importantly, unlike Egypt, farmers had to rely simply on the weather. And so if they go a year or 2 years without rain, there is no way to recover from that. Whereas both in Mesopotamia and even more so in Egypt, there were great rivers that were fed from mountains hundreds and thousands of miles away, not dependent on the local climate. And so Israel didn't have those types of rivers that could irrigate the land. And so, like many before, Abram heads to Egypt in times of difficulties. We have lots of archaeological records that show us other seemingly Semitic people going to Egypt when they encounter famine. And so Abram seems to represent a memory of a real historical part of the lives of those who lived in Palestine at that time. Abram goes down to Egypt, and Egypt becomes both a place of blessing for him, as he's able to allow his family to survive and to really flourish by the time he leaves, but it's also a place of challenge, especially challenge to his faith. And we see Abram do this again in chapter 20. So both in chapter 12 and 20, during famines, Abram does not want to acknowledge his wife. He's scared that he will be killed because his wife is a beautiful woman and would be appealing to the Pharaoh or to the king of Gerar, Abimelech. So he says, we are simply sisters. This ruse quickly comes to light, and God works through both Pharaoh and the king of Gerar, Abimelech, to correct Abram, to challenge Abraham to be more faithful in God, rather than to figure out all these various things through sly and underhand ways. So we see this note sounded in chapter 12. That is great as the faith of Abram's is, and it is a great faith, it still needs to grow. He still needs to accept God's ways rather than taking shortcuts or detours in that great way which he is on the path of. So they survive and they come back very wealthy from the land of Egypt. But there are new challenges that await them as they kind of move through this existence. Now, we see some of the rivalries that we have found in earlier stories and we'll see in later stories surfacing in this story. We see a rivalry between Abram and Lot. These are two relatives that have come from Mesopotamia, and yet there's competition between them. And we see Abram very much taking the high road. They're squabbling over what land is theirs and how to distinguish their flocks and all those types of things, and coming to difficulties with them. And Abram simply says to Lot, you take what you need. So with Lot, we see that he takes the more fertile Jordan plain, seemingly on the east side of Jordan, land that would be better. And therefore Abram is relegated to the highlands, more challenging land, But it's a challenge that Abram is up to, and he therefore continues to thrive and prosper. So we see Abraham, in many respects, reflecting, this value that's so important, the value of peace and the value of justice. Rather than going to the violence that afflicted Cain, that afflicted the people of Noah's time, we see Abram taking a new route, a route closer to the Lord. Then we move from chapter 13 to chapter 14, and we find really a chapter that can be quite puzzling, because chapter 14 is going a little bit differently than the rest of the story. And some have noted that if we simply erased the name Abram and put in the name Gideon, one of the great judges from the book of Judges, which we find in about 5 books after this, we would have a character more similar to the book of Judges in Abram and what he does. So the key to this character here is that he fights aggressive wars with 4 kings. And this shows him as more of a deliverer than as someone kind of following God's call, someone who was operating out of peace and justice that we found in chapter 13. That said, we know that Abram had real concerns and real difficulties. And we find within this chapter this confrontation with foreigners, difficult foreigners, but at the same time we find a great blessing from another foreign king, Melchizedek, someone that is very important for us to reflect on, and especially, let's say, within a Catholic understanding of the Bible. Because Melchizedek is a figure, a priestly figure, a foreign priestly figure, who is quite different than the priests of Israel, and really, in many respects, unrecognizable as an Israelite priest. But to the writer of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, he represents Christ's priesthood, because Melchizedek comes to Abram with gifts of bread and wine, and he's clearly a priest. And so we'll see that Christ takes these same elements of bread and wine and transforms the Jewish people and the whole world through them. So we have a foreshadowing of that. We hear the priest Melchizedek mentioned in our first Eucharistic prayer, and it's an important part of Genesis for us as Catholics. It's also important for Abram because he learns the value of foreigners and how foreigners can point in the direction of thanksgiving, that foreigners can give him important lessons. So we come then to the end of the 14th chapter and move into a very important chapter in the 15th chapter. Here we find Abram starting to have difficulties. These promises that we heard in chapter 12 of land, of blessing, of a great nation, are promises that are becoming harder for Abram at this point to see. This has been foreshadowed also in our introduction to Abram and Sarah in chapter 11. Because one of the things that we note about Sarah, and this can drive the whole story, is that Sarah is barren. So Abram becomes less concerned, seemingly, with a nation and with land than just simply a son he can call his own. And so this then becomes the center of chapter 15. And we find that God continues this promise. Abram at this stage had started to think about, well, how can I do this differently? I think he had considered Lot as someone who could be his heir, and then that fell apart. He had considered Eliezer, one of his servants, as someone who could be his heir, and seemingly God didn't want that. And God goes on, there will be an heir. The promise will be fulfilled. And so chapter 15 reasserts that, and at the same time we have to remember that it's not the pinnacle of this material. The material still is developing. And so within chapter 16, we see a false start in the direction of an error. We see that Sarah, or Sarai, as she's known until chapter 17, is still having problems and is still barren. Things still aren't working. We can feel the tension and the drama increasing in this compelling story. So ultimately, Sarai feels that she must do something about this and gives Abram her handmaid, Hagar, her slave, Hagar. Now, this connotes, and this brings us to a very different type of problem than what we've seen earlier. We've looked at the problems between men, between Cain and Abel, to a certain extent between Lot and Abram. But one of the centerpieces of this story is the rivalries between women. And so we find that Hagar is able to become pregnant very quickly, and yet Hagar becomes a great rival of Sarai. And all these emotions that we saw come to the surface in the story of Cain and Abel now come to the surface in the story of Hagar and Sarai. And Hagar perhaps sees herself differently now that she's pregnant. Sarai certainly sees herself in a different manner. It sees Hagar in a different manner. And we find all kinds of difficulties between them. But there's a great lesson here. Hagar is forced out of this dynamic. She's forced to flee. And she's feeling very sad for herself, very unhappy, and off she goes. But she bites off more than she can chew. The Egyptian slave of Abram and Sarai is out in the desert, unable to take care of herself. And yet, normally we see that slaves and people traveling through the deserts are relegated, are not seen, are cast aside. God comes to the help and assistance of Hagar. And very uniquely in these stories, Hagar becomes the only person in the Bible that names God. She says, "You are the God of vision, El Roi." So this is a very important point. So once again, we see foreigners offering great leadership within this. We see Melchizedek offering a blessing. Now we see Hagar realizing the importance of God and even naming God, and God hearing this lowly slave's voice crying out in the desert. Certainly, this leads us to think of Mary in the Gospel of Luke, in the famous canticle of Mary, where God hears the lowly and lifts them up. So we've had this child born now to Hagar, and this child Ishmael, who will be the leader of a great nation. And even Ishmael is very important for understanding how we learn about God in this story. Ishmael means God hears. El at the end of it, standing for Elohim or Allah in Arabic, and then Shema, to hear. So God hears the lowly. God hears those with no one else. And we find Hagar pointing that to us. Then we move to the 17th chapter, where we see a whole new side of God and Abram's relationship develop. Here we find a new covenant. We have this promise renewed that God will take care of Abram. And as a sign of that promise, we see circumcision. This is very much moving a little bit away from that promise that we heard in chapter 12 of a great nation, of blessing, and focusing more on the familial and doing something that will keep this nation alive when they have to go into exile, when all government breaks down. We see this basic family unit as allowing Israel to survive. And so in chapter 17, we have the great covenant promise made. We move from that covenant promise then to a number of challenging incidents in chapter 18 and chapter 19. We see that God goes on to confirm his promise to them, his promise to Abraham and Sarah now, as their names have been changed with the covenant. And God sends, and this is something new, 3 agents. So these 3 agents that God sends are received by Abram, and they're received through Abram's hospitality. Hospitality is what allows Abraham to be delivered. They say that Sarah will give birth to a son, and that's met with kind of derision, with laughter, with disbelief and cynicism. And so once again we see where there's some difficulties here, that Abraham's faith isn't always perfect, and he must grow into seeing that God makes a way where there is no way. So we find that hospitality is really, in many respects, what saves Abraham with these 3 messengers. Then we move into perhaps the most disturbing section of this story at the end of chapter 18 and 19, where, in something a little bit reminiscent of the Noah incident, God is completely dismayed by the conduct of the people in the city of Lot, in Lot's city of Sodom. And God wants to simply destroy that city. We find here, though, the greatness of Abraham. Abraham is pushed forward by this vision of 126 through 128, that we're made in the image and likeness of God. He has a care for these people. He wants justice done in this city. And he goes on to a very long, down-to-earth dialogue with God, in many ways teaching us how to bring our problems to God, to discuss them, and to pray with God. At the end of this, he finds something that he can live with. If there are only a few righteous people in this town, God will take mercy on it. But in that story that I think we're all familiar with, we see a lack of righteousness. We see utter contempt for the guests that come to this town, and we see a sexual exploitation of them. And so this then ends up condemning this city. But I think, as these stories are often pulled into political debates, it's important to keep a larger sense of what was going on before this story, and what ends up saving Abram, and what ends up in many ways condemning this city, and that is hospitality. By hospitality to God's messengers that Abram couldn't recognize, Israel survives. By lack of hospitality, the city of Sodom seals its fate. From there, we move into chapter 20 again, and we see a repeat of the story of chapter 12, but this time focused in the south to the south of Israel in Gerar, the city of Abimelech. And then we find the answer fulfilled in chapter 21. So there we see Isaac born, and we see Abram's faith, Sarah's faith, restored completely. And with that restoration, rather than laughter of derision and doubt, we see laughter of joy. And Isaac, therefore, is named for that joyful laughter in chapter 21. With that comes some sadness, as we see the rivalry between women emerge once again. And this time, rather than played out as strictly between the women, it's between their sons. And so Ishmael is sent off on his way, but Ishmael is sent with a promise. And we should always remember his name, God hears. From that, we move to a fairly quick conclusion to the story, but a conclusion that is full of some difficulty. And perhaps the most difficult chapter of all the Old Testament is that 22nd chapter of Genesis. Within the 22nd chapter of Genesis, we see this test that Abram gets, a test where he's asked to sacrifice his son. Much theology and much philosophy has been consumed with this chapter and trying to understand it, and I think all too frequently trying to explain it away. Whereas I don't think we can ever get beyond the fact that this truly is a test. But it's a test that Abram's faith helps him to pass. And so where he has wavered before, where he has relied on his own instincts, where he has tried to figure things out for himself, we've had problems in Egypt, we've had problems with Abimelech, we've had problems where he goes alone and laughs at God. Here he simply answers the test and God provides. That's how it ends. But it's a troubling test where he's asked to sacrifice his son, and something that I think should lead us to more contemplation on the mysteries, on the things that we've seen already that we can't quite understand about this, about the Bible. And at times, the capriciousness of God comes forth, perhaps where humans don't perfectly understand God's revelation. Our final episode, or let's say our final important episode, is the death of Sarah and her burial. So in chapter 23, we find this kind of episode of Abram and Sarah being the key figures come to an end. But what we see is Abram very focused on now giving his wife a proper burial. And we see then that burial is an important part of our traditions as humans. How we care for the sick, how we remember the sick, how we allow the dead to continue moving forward in our life is witnessed here by Abram as he focuses on his faithful wife of many years, Sarah, and he tries to be true to her witness. So Abraham goes into negotiations, buys a plot of land, and becomes really shifts from let's say an exile to inhabitant of the land, burying his wife there. He buries his wife near a tree, and we see that as Abram moves through the land, we see him planting trees, we see him seeing trees. We see trees as very much the motif of his faithfulness. And in that, a great irony. Whereas the tree of good and evil had led Adam and Eve into much difficulty, trees are a sign of Abram's faithfulness, and as well as a sign of Abram's connection to God's will. So, as we conclude this lecture, we're left with some important some important questions. How do we see the covenant developing here? How does it shift? What does the covenant mean for our own life? What covenants do we have? How does Abram's story of faith match our stories? What can we learn from Abraham's great faith? And finally, we can consider the importance of Abraham, of where he settled in Israel, and of that witness of faith for our lives.